Greetings. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. Today we are jumping into John chapter 13, verse 31. We'll pick up there in just a moment. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our study today. Gentlemen, it's good to see everyone. At some point, we need to get Brendan, pull him back into the study. We've got to take him out back behind the shed and give him a good stern talking to. But his life has gotten busy, I'm sure. And so we miss him. But we want to thank you for joining us, taking the time out of your busy schedule to stop for about an hour today to study the Word of God. And hopefully you'll find it beneficial. I know that I always do. I enjoy studying with these guys here. We may not always see eye to eye, especially on what time of day it is, but we still like to study together. All right, let me see. We have Caleb Davis with us, Jerry Wilcox, Aline Haynes, David Clark is with us also, and Jimmy Kersey. If this is the first time you've joined us for our study, kind of let us know who you are if you don't mind. Tell us, if you're Bob from Minnesota or whatever, just say hi. And if you have any thoughts or comments, share them with us. We do live stream this on our, what am I looking for? Right here. We live stream this on our Facebook page, Truth Factor Live, on our YouTube channel, Truth Factor Live. Both of those have comment or chat areas that you can use to participate in the study. Or you can send us an email if you would like, questions@truthfactorlive.com. Questions@truthfactorlive.com. All right. Well, gentlemen, let's go ahead and jump into our study from today. How do you, in the chat room, is it Hetty Brickell or Hattie Brickell? She's from the island of Man. I think that's right. What did you say, Bob?
Hetty Brickell.
Hetty Brickell. Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. It's good to have you with us, Miss Hetty. Okay. Let's go ahead. We're picking up in John chapter 13, verse 31. And as always with these type of studies, if we're not able to do a chapter break, we're kind of starting into the middle of a context here. But we've just had Jesus. He's finishing up with his apostles. We see the identification of Judas as the one who was going to betray him. Having received the piece of bread, he then went out immediately, and it was night. So we pick up kind of Jesus now continues talking with his disciples after Judas has gone out. Verse 31, let's read down through verse 35. Let me increase the font size a couple of notches here. Okay. And let's see. Brian, would you mind reading for us 31 through 35 of John chapter 13?
Yeah, and I'll be reading from the New King James Version. John chapter 13, verse 31. So when he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glorify him immediately. Little children, I shall be with you only a little while longer. You will seek me. And as I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. So now I say to you, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you, so that you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
All righty. Thank you, Brian. So stepping back to verse 31, Judas is now departed. He has separated himself to do what he had set out to do there. Brian, his statement, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. Is this statement here basically referring to the culmination of the plan of the salvation of man, the coming of the kingdom? Because we are on the verge, the nigh, if you would, of his death. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Back in chapter 12, we remember that Jesus had called upon the Father. He said, the Father, now is the hour. And the hour, of course, was a reference he'd been making all along to the moment of his death. And so he says, now the hour has come, the Son of Man should be glorified. The Father spoke from heaven that he would glorify him. We see again in chapter 14 where he says that whatever you ask in my name, the Father, that would happen because that would glorify the Father too. So, we can make a couple of different ways of considering this, but we probably really are talking about the idea that the time has come for him to accomplish this purpose that he has come to the earth for. He'll say, he said back in the last chapter, I'm anxious about this, but this is why I came. This is why I'm here. So it's something that he's going to accomplish, even though it's a great anxiety to him. And by accomplishing it, this brings glory to the Father. This is the divine purpose of Jesus's being on earth. So this is the language that he's using.
Yeah. And it's hard for them to comprehend this. They have no idea what's going to happen as far as they know what he has been saying, but it won't be until they fully witness it. Yeah.
You all right, Paul?
Yeah, he's having to deal with something. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on that? About Jesus saying, if God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him immediately. So the him is referring to the Son of Man. But we know the Son of Man is Jesus.
Right.
But it is interesting that he refers to the Son of Man in kind of like the third person there.
Yeah.
That is kind of interesting. Jesus uses this term Son of Man all throughout the New Testament. And it's interesting because he's almost always talking about himself separate from himself. So he's called the Son of God. He calls himself the Son of Man. I've always thought that's interesting. The term of Son of Man is neat because I think it's about 90 times it's going to be used by Jesus in the New Testament. And then about 90 times it's used in the book of Ezekiel, talking about that prophet. And it probably is really emphasizing, and the other places in the Old Testament it uses it, it emphasizes the idea that the Son of Man is frail. He's like, I think Isaiah says, the Son of Man is like grass, all these things about someone that can die easily, that can, that they're frail, they're weak. And so Jesus, uses this term to describe his condition as being a human. So the Son of God, we would say the Son of God couldn't die, but the Son of Man can. Jesus is both, so he can die. And it's a really remarkable concept, the way that those two terms go back and forth, each talking about a different characteristic of the nature of Jesus.
I have long thought that, at least in part, Son of Man would refer to him as the epitome of manhood. He came to reveal not only what God is, but what man ought to be.
Yeah. Think about which is greater in statement. The Son of God was raised from the dead, or the Son of Man was raised from the dead. When you think about the Son of Man being raised from the dead, that goes back to what you were talking about. The emphasis of the weaknesses of his humanity. And the fact that the Son of Man is, and the reason why I say raised from the dead, because that's part of the process of the glorification there. Because it was the man Jesus who died and was raised from the dead, as far as the physical man Jesus who died and raised from the dead. He was the Son of God as well, but the emphasis he seems to place on that aspect.
I think there's a lot to that. I think that's a very good observation.
Could we make I know this is just something came to my head. I had to be careful with last second thoughts because they sound good until I say them out loud. It's like, why did I say that? Anyway, when you think about what Romans 10:9 and 10, that we have to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, I recognize that Jesus talks about I have the power to lay down my life and power to raise it up again. But Paul says that's what we need to believe. That kind of overlaps this, or at least points at this statement in a way. Because it's not just the Son of Man who's glorified, but God himself is glorified through the events that take place. So, just something to consider. Okay. All right, so continuing forward there in verse 33, and let me bring it back up for everybody at home there. Little children, I shall be with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come, so now I say to you. He will get into this discussion a little bit more when we hit chapters 14 through 16 there. But his point here in this section isn't so much that he's going to go away and not be with them anymore. That's a significant point. But it sounds like he's leading up really to verses 34 and 35 and regarding this new commandment that he's to give them. Let's talk about that for a minute. Any thoughts about this new commandment, verses 34 and 35?
Yeah, it's new only in that he has now imbued it with his personal example.
Okay.
We've always, I mean, the second commandment was love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not new as far as love your neighbor is concerned. But love one another as I have loved you. That to me is the newness of it. He has demonstrated his love and helped us to appreciate even more what that is all about. And John tells us in his first epistle, he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for one another. I can't believe I visited a preacher at the congregation where he was and taught the class, and there was actually a controversy over that verse. Well, John didn't mean that we ought to lay down our lives for our friends. Well, he said we ought to lay down our lives for our friends. And, of course, that's not talking about, it's talking about sacrifice on their behalf, doing anything and everything we can to prevent their death. And you know, like I protect you with my life. You know, it's the way people are with their children. They'll die to protect their children, and we ought to be willing to die to protect one another.
Right. You know, when you think about that, it's the idea of being willing to lay down your life. The point is if you had to, you would do it. You know, and the emphasis there is the depth of love. You know, tying these verses to verse 33, where Jesus is talking about I'm leaving, and like you said, we're going to deal more with that in especially chapter 14. You know, where I'm going, you can't come. Jesus is saying, you know what, my time on earth is done. And now more than ever, you need to love each other. You're going to need each other, which means you need to have this. You need to understand what it means to need each other. Remember, if we tie what Jesus has just done to what we believe is the context based on the other gospels, they're again arguing about who's the greatest. You know, even on this night of his betrayal, you know, they're fighting for position, and Jesus does that act of washing their feet, and then he emphasizes other things, and now he says, "Look, I can tell you this while I'm with you, but I'm not going to be here physically with you. You all have to love each other, and the world needs that." You know, a couple of years ago, 2, 3, I don't remember how many, but a few years ago, I came across a resource dealing with these verses here, these two verses, this new commandment I give you, that you love one another. And one of the points that I got out of it, and when I preach on this, I say this quite a bit. Verse 35 says, "By this, all will know that you are my disciples if you have a love for one another." I believe that verse says that the way that we love each other is a characteristic by which the world has the right to judge us. You know, the world is looking, and you know, we always talk about our example and stuff, and what Jesus is emphasizing is, you know what, you all are going to be the church. You all are going to be the brethren, and if you want people to be a part of you, you know, they have a right to judge you by the way you treat each other, by whether or not you love each other the way you ought to, because that's fundamental where the church is concerned. Of course, the word love here is the agape, you know, and you just plug that into every relationship we have as Christians. God loving us, Jesus loving us loving God, us loving Jesus, us loving one another as brethren, our neighbors, our enemies, our family. This love has to be there for everything. And so I just think that's a powerful thought, you know, to think about what the world has the right to judge where we are concerned.
Yeah, that's really neat. That's a neat thought.
Yeah, hadn't thought about that. One thought to come back to real quick about this, and it's in 1 John 3:16 where he says more directly, by this we know love because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Could we also look at this statement and the one in John chapter 15, verse 13? Greater love is no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friend. And then he says, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you. Should we not look at this in part, the value of the person's life? Not limited to their physical life, but the value of that person altogether in regards to the salvation of their souls. Jesus did not die on the cross for our own physical life. You know, think about the illustration, a kid's in the road, here comes a semi-truck, you run out, push the kid out of the way. You don't even think twice about it. If you were to, you would know that you would die in doing that. But his death for us wasn't to save our physical life, but his death was to save something greater. You know, what shall a man give in exchange for his soul is kind of the question there. Well, Jesus saw the soul of so value, us of such great value, that he's willing to die for us. And I'm not saying it wouldn't apply to the physical. We need to be willing to lay down our life for our friends. But I think the greater point may be our brethren's souls are so great that we need to do all that we can to make certain that they don't lose their life. What do you think? Is that possible, or do you think Jesus is making a physical statement using himself as the spiritual example of it?
I tell you what, John, I had not thought about that, but that makes so much sense. Life is much more than physical. Jesus said that how many times? He that who would save his life will lose it. He that will lose his life for my sake shall save it. And so there's always that dichotomy there between the physical life and the spiritual life, or the mortal life and the immortal life.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's a good point.
Okay. Well, appreciate that. Any other thoughts? We got a few comments in the chat room I want to bring in, but all right, let's go ahead and back up a little bit. I missed this comment earlier. Apologize, Jimmy, for this. Where is it? There we go. Jimmy said earlier, by using Son of Man, it also shows that he, Jesus, or he is and was born in flesh. And that's right. And Brian makes the point there in the chat room itself, which is a key part of his identity and our salvation. And then Caleb, he says, it fulfills the promise God made all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And then think about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, etc. And Brian, in one word, he says, so much indeed. And then Jimmy, he then comments, Jesus is the perfect example of loving everyone. I think he uses this reference many times, knowing how hard it is for folks to love one another. Not only does he continue to love one another, but he's very repetitious with it. And that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point, Jimmy. All right.
Yeah,
any other thoughts?
Brian was a man of few words, and I guess it's because a few words will do.
Indeed. Okay. Any other thoughts on this final section here? And Tom already touched on verse 35, but go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I was just saying, maybe one other thought. Sometimes I look at this statement about the new commandment, and Bob mentioned earlier that this isn't new. This is something God has commanded repeatedly throughout the scriptures. So sometimes I look at this too, is that it's not just that Jesus saying that this is a single new commandment. I kind of look at it, the idea that Jesus is talking about his entire law, which is the law of Christ is about to be established, and the law of Moses, the pre-existing law, is about to be done away with his death. And there's a number of times in the New Testament where later we're told that the whole law is summed up in the concept of love one another and love God. Romans 13, owe no one anything except love, for he who loves fulfills the law. He says it again, that love is the fulfillment of the law in the next verse. Galatians 5:14, the law is fulfilled in one word, love. James 2 verse 8, you fulfill the royal law if you love your neighbor. This concept, it is different than the law of Moses, because the law of Moses isn't founded in love. I mean, your relationship to God in the covenant that Moses mediates has nothing to do with love. You're brought into it before you know anything. You're brought into it at 8 years old. You're not aware of it. And God, the prophets had talked about God wanting a covenant where people were choosing to join it, and they did that choice is because of love, the love of God, and it's manifested in the love for each other. And so I think there's several ways we could approach this passage. I think it's actually a pretty rich, pretty full idea. And just sometimes I like to kind of say this could also be one of those points where Jesus is trying to transition, that we're about to see a great change of law itself. Like the Hebrew writer will say, there's going to be a change of priesthood that necessitates a change of law. And that's something I see in here too.
That's a good point. Now, do we want to talk any about the fact that John addresses this again somewhat, not really as a new commandment, but an old commandment? Because in 1 John 2:7, now the writing of the books were probably pretty close together. But what John records is the words of Jesus at the beginning. But then he comes back around to this in 1 John chapter 2, verse 7. Depending on where you put or date the writing of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, this could be, 60 years later from the time that Jesus said it, roughly. And what I'm referencing here is 1 John chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, verse 7, really. He says, brethren, I write no new commandment to you, but an old commandment which you've had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you heard from the beginning. And I believe that's beginning of the teachings of Jesus. That going back to what y'all were talking about in regards to this being a new commandment, the start of all things. And he says, again, a new commandment I write to you, which thing is true. And then he touches on it. Verse 9, he who says he's in the light and hates his brother is in darkness until now. He who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause for stumbling. I just thought it was interesting that after about 60 years, give or take, John is still having to remind the brethren of the very teachings of Jesus that we're looking at in John 13, 34, and 35. Any thoughts? Okay.
I think you're right. Sufficient time had passed that even the other apostles might not have been thinking about this, but the other apostles were killed. I'm thinking before John. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking that John was the epistles. I believe all the scriptures had been written prior to AD 70. That just makes so much sense to me. Although John lived beyond that stage, but it had probably been a long time since they had read the Gospel of John. The uninspired men, I mean. And so he's reminding them of this, that it's an old commandment, but then it's a new commandment too.
Yeah.
And so it's always been God's will for us to love one another, for his people to love one another. But now, especially in view of what Jesus demonstrated in giving his life for us.
Yeah.
Okay. There's something that I see here, that's something that I've just observed. By this all will know that you are my disciples, that congregations that are close-knit and have a wonderful, loving atmosphere among themselves, it's obviously they care about one another, that they have the best interest of one another at heart, that they are likely to be the growing congregations. But congregations that are inwardly fighting and have trouble never grow. They're too focused on their inward parts. And so no one really knows about Jesus from them because they're so involved with their own problems and their own trials and struggles and can't get along with one another. until the local brethren learn to get along, they will never grow. And I don't know if that's really what Jesus had in mind here. Probably not. But I think it is a truth that connects well with this.
I think it's profound truth. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it somewhat applies. Like I said, I pointed out a few minutes ago, it's tied to the beginning of this chapter and what Jesus is doing and emphasizing. So I definitely think that's the case. I don't you find it interesting? You can go into a congregation and you can feel the tension if it's there. Or anyway,
Yeah.
you can go into a room and you can know there's, and I can't explain that. I mean, I know that animals sometimes have better intuition than us as far as sensing those types of things, but you can go into a room or a church and you can pretty quickly tell how they feel about each other, and people that are looking for a place to go, I mean, if they see drama there and they hear the comments and they can see the comments are snide remarks or there's hidden messages in the comments, those kind of things. Why would they want to come back? Why would they want to even consider a church like that?
Yeah.
And that's true with the apostles. It's going to be hard enough. You're going to get enemies. You're going to have plenty of enemies, even if you do everything right. Don't make more.
Yeah. Do you sense the tension or the love?
Yeah, you can sense both of them. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you feel like you could cut the tension with a knife, there's not a whole lot of spiritual growth going on there. I don't know if I mentioned to you about preaching on love and smiling. In one congregation, very small congregation, I was filling in for the man who was preaching a gospel meeting for us where I was. And I preached a sermon, The Art of Getting Along with Others. And one of the points I was making was, smile. And I talked for a few seconds about how that yawns are contagious and smiles are too. You can't hardly smile at somebody without them. Sorry about that, John. Without them smiling back at me. I smiled real big and looked around, and not a one of them was smiling back at me. And they made a liar out of it. So that was not a loving congregation.
I think what you say is really true. You fellows have shared that, you know it. You know it when you see it. You know it when it's not there, and I think that's exactly right.
Well, this is where it kind of gets a little bit not really subjective. It's possible for a congregation to have a bad day. Okay, series of events. For instance, I know if things don't go well for whatever reason, all right, you have kids, whatever. There's some Sunday mornings I get there, and I'm in a bad mood, and people know it. Now, no one says, "Hey, what's wrong with you?" At least to my face, but I'm not as chipper, I'm not as chatty. I'm just in a bad mood, and I don't like that at all. But we came together to worship the Lord, and so I will eventually get through that. But then most of the time, it's a good mood. Now, if a visitor comes in, I'll be friendly and everything. But people that know me may say this is an off day for him. He's in a bad mood. We don't know what's wrong. Someday, visitors may come into a congregation when a series of recent events have happened, that there is a bit of a tension. But hopefully, they'll come back later. And this is where the danger comes in. If we don't welcome them, receive them with kindness and make them feel welcome, then they may not come back. But hopefully they'll come back and realize, okay, the church isn't the way that I thought it was that day. It was just a bad day, I guess, lack of a better way of putting it. But if you're always that way, whether it's me as an individual or the church collectively always in a bad mood or whatever, then yeah, you're right. There's not the love, there's not the growth there.
I can truly say that this is not about any of the guys here. But how many times have you heard preachers talk about the congregation where they work and they don't give glowing thoughts about those people, and maybe it's just the truth, and the truth hurts sometimes, but I know that places that I mean, I've been blessed to work with some of the very best people and loving congregations, but I really hate to hear a preacher, say, oh, maybe they're in a gospel meeting or something. Well, back home, we just don't have, whatever. And we, just speak in disparaging ways about the local congregation. I mean, you represent them. And I do my best to put our best foot forward, because I really believe that. And like I said, maybe it's in other places, it's just the truth, and that's unpleasant. But I think it's important to.
I think, Paul, what you're saying is profoundly important. I think if a preacher doesn't respect the people he is working with, he probably shouldn't be working with them, because you're in a position of submission to the brethren, and like a wife submits to a husband and respects her husband. We're serving them, we're trying to help them and enable them, and if we don't respect them, genuinely respect them, this probably isn't the place for us to preach.
And not just a preacher, but any member of a congregation.
Yes.
Before
Yes.
they say anything about the rest of the congregation, what if the rest of the congregation was saying this about me? And what would that reflect? And would that be an encouragement to me or discouragement? So I think we ought to speak encouraging words anytime we can.
Well, let me share two thoughts. I'm going to try to not forget the second one. But imagine going to a mechanic, and you talk to the mechanic. You say, I've got a problem with my car. I can't figure it out. The mechanic says, oh, that's interesting. And you say, have you ever seen this before? Oh, yeah, it won't be a problem. I'll be able to fix it. So you've dealt with this before. Well, my car's been having this problem for the last 10 years, and I've not been able to fix it yet, but I'm sure we can fix yours, And it's kind of like saying, we're going to preach a lesson on love. Now, the church where I'm, my home congregation, we ain't got no love, but I'll tell you how to have love. I would wonder if I was a member saying, no, wait a minute, why should I listen to you? You're supposed to be teaching them, and you're telling us the congregation is that bad, then you're clearly not as effective as what you're making us think you are. So anyway, I don't remember what the second thing was. I know I was going to forget it, but it's kind of what came to mind when y'all were talking about that. Oh, I know what it is. Sorry. I call them cheerleader sermons. Okay. Where you're going to preach on a subject, and you get up there, and half your sermon is telling the congregation how bad everybody else is, how wrong all the other churches are, how terrible everybody else is on this. But we're not that way, and we thank God that we're not that way. And so it's kind of like a cheerleader sermon. Well, if you're going to do that in a gospel meeting, and you're used to doing that, and you're dealing with the subject that could pertain to a local church, that's when you may pull up the dregs of where you're from. Let me tell you how bad the congregation is I am from, so you can feel good about how you're doing, if that makes sense. That may be one of the thoughts I should keep to myself, but I just, In other words, we should build members up by teaching them the Word of God. Build members up by saying, here's what the Bible teaches. Now, if you're not doing it, shame on you. You need to do it. Okay? If you are doing it, do it better. Not saying, let me tell you how bad everyone else is so that you'll feel better about what little you are doing. Sometimes is how that could come across.
Yeah. And
Well,
we
here
also,
the congregation usually, shouts out 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? So maybe that's what you're talking about, John.
yeah. And who is it that they name?
Paul Adams.
Just to add one thing to what you said, John. Not only do we need to be teaching about this, we need to show it.
Exactly.
That's the point, is the application.
Yeah. That's exactly right. They need to see the preacher doing the same thing that he's preaching on. And not just him, but all the members. Yeah.
But it is sad when brethren who talk about how we are a loving church and we are a church family, they're not always the ones that show themselves to be family members of the local church. And
Yeah.
they're putting the lie really to what they claim. Maybe the church loves one another except for you. You know, I mean, they love you, but you clearly don't love them. And so we just really need to be consistent in that practice and spread that love around. And we might, it doesn't mean we have to uh, uh, have as close a relationship with each person as we do some, because we're going to have likes and dislikes. We're going to be
Commonalities.
and we're going to do things together that we might not think about including, but maybe sometimes we need to include others that are outside our clique, so to speak, to let them know that we love them.
Yeah, great. We have several comments that have come in, and one of them kind of rebukes me a little bit, and it's a very good point. Let me start with Eileen. She says we need to remember our body language can shout volumes. That's true. Sometimes it might be misread, but more times than not, it is read properly. Yeah. And David, he says, bad moods or bad days aren't supposed to enter the Lord's house. Worldly things are left at the door. And David, you're right about that. All things being equal, no matter what has happened outside of worship, when we come in, we should leave all that on the coat rack at the door, and worship the Lord unhindered by those things. You're not wrong about that. You're not wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's hard.
Yeah.
And we are, every Christian is, I'm not trying to say this in a Calvinist way, but every Christian is human. And so we also need to be, when a brother is hurting or troubled, we need to be sympathetic and helpful. And so yes, what the gentleman said was right. We need to do our best to lay that aside. Don't pick a fight with your wife on Sunday morning just before you're heading out to worship. There's lots of good advice, that we could talk about in preparing for worship. Yeah. But we are human, and so when you see someone that looks very troubled, that it is a safe place to bring those troubles, and so to try to help one another.
Right.
Don't
Yeah.
fight with your wife, because you're going to lose.
Well,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And building on the point that Paul was saying there, no matter if you're having a bad day, if you're dealing with something, it doesn't matter how much you don't want to reflect that. There's going to be some of it there. And again, what David said is right. We need to do our absolute best to try and leave those things at the door and leave it in the hands of God. I mean, that is kind of what Jesus is talking about when he says, don't worry, and all those types of things. But the bottom line is, those, for lack of a better term, moods, they ought to be the exception rather than the rule.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that, and by the way, if they are the exception rather than the rule, this goes to some of what Paul said. They're going to know it. Your brethren are going to know it, and they know something's not right. And how many times have you been asked, is something wrong? I know I have. And yeah, there's underlying things, and you may not want to share them, but there are things that are wrong, and brethren can see that because they know you, and that's because we do love each other the way that we ought to, or that's only going to be the case if we love each other and we prefer each other and we are there for each other and we spend time together with each other.
And I tell you, do y'all not agree that sometimes the hardest things to do are the things we most need to do?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I have caught myself in reflection, having said something in Bible class that I shouldn't have said, or I shouldn't have said it that way. And I just had to, publicly apologize the next time we, came together because it was something that I shouldn't have said, or shouldn't have said in the way that I said it. And yeah, that's hard. But it's part of swallowing your pride, and which Christians should not have in the first place. But if you got it, you need to swallow it.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And sometimes when that's what you're struggling with, why is it that's when somebody pushes your button, in class, whether they mean to or not. But I mean, that becomes, and then it becomes doubly more challenging for you to just calm yourself, to make sure that you don't do or say the wrong thing. And like you said, there's times where we're human. We're going to do things, and that's where apologies have to come in, and those types of things, and clarifications, and again, when we love each other, those things are accepted. Siblings fight. But siblings don't let anybody else fight with their siblings. And those, all that stuff, just things to think about.
Yeah.
I've seen the most discipleship of Christ in those who are genuinely trying to love the brethren. That's what Jesus says.
Yep. Couple of thoughts real quick. We have a comment from Jimmy early on. I'm going to come back to another comment we have in there. But Jimmy says, on those bad days, a smile will go further than one thinks. That's a good point. And then Caleb, he says, I think the point should be made. We are not as good as we think we are. And other churches are not as bad as we might think they are. That's an interesting point. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and bring in, although Brian, you kind of addressed it a little bit, and it's a little bit off topic, but it goes back to something we were saying last week. Stephanie says, concerning a question last week that was asked, is suicide a sin? I'm thinking that Job 36:20 is declaring that even the thought of suicide is sin. Different translations affect the reading, but the King James Version to me says that both suicide is a sin, and also even thinking of suicide as a sin, which actually makes sense because sin starts in the heart. Wondering your thoughts on that. Brian, do you want to share what you kind of said about that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Last week we were talking about Judas and his ultimately that he committed suicide, and talked about suicide in the Bible, how the scriptures give us this very strong image of people that are without God tend to be people that ultimately act on suicide. And so the comment is, is it possible just thinking about suicide is a sin? And I'll be careful to say that maybe it's one of those times where there are thoughts that come to our mind that dwelling on them becomes where something could become sinful as opposed to just the thought itself. But there's a lot of times in the Bible where godly people felt, we might say suicidal. I mean, Jeremiah, Jonah, Elijah, Moses, those are all 4 prophets who specifically said, I wish I was dead. That they were in just a real tough predicament. They were, they had failed. They were struggling. They were suffering. And just this idea of wishing you were dead, it could be classified as a suicidal, thought. David writes a lot of Psalms where he's talking about, I feel like I'm already dead. I'm already in the grave. I'm already gone. So I would say I'm not sure what that's a neat comment in Job, one I hadn't thought of before that way, and it was a really neat comment about the idea of don't desire the night, don't desire these things, but I think it's more probably akin to what Paul said when he was talking about the idea in Philippians 2, if I die, I get to be with Christ, but if I live, I get to serve God. That we should be people that don't say, hey, I just want to be done here and move on. We should be people that say, hey, I've got some things I need to be doing for God. And I think that might be the more relevant point. I think sometimes people could be in a terrible amount of pain. They can be dying. They can be near death, and they wish death would come. And they, like I said, the suicidal thought is certainly going to cross your mind. I don't think just, I would probably say it's not Job saying that just thinking about suicide is a sin. But I also think that Job was in a pretty unique situation that him saying, I'm not going to think about it is probably because he's on the cusp of, being, that's a very possible thing that could happen in his circumstance. So he's not even going to think about it. And so I think there's that element too. But it was a great question. Wow, what a question. And it brought me something I hadn't thought about before that passage.
Yeah, and just for sake of clarification, in the text, Elihu is the one speaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got the, and Elihu is the younger and smarter of the friends.
What you would have to do is go back to the chapter and progress through the thoughts to see what is the context that leads up to that particular phrase, to have the full understanding, I should say, of what he's talking about there. But that's interesting. Yeah, I had not heard that passage used in that regards either. All right, let me check on the time now. Appreciate that, Stephanie. Appreciate that. All right, let's see. We have just a few minutes remaining. Let's take a moment and finish up the chapter. Paul, would you mind reading for us verses 36 through 38? And then we'll close up chapter 13.
Certainly, and I'm reading out of the New King James Version today. And John 13, beginning at verse 36, and I'll read through the end of the chapter. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. Jesus answered him, Will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times.
Okay. All righty. Thank you, Mr. Paul. Bring us back here for a minute. Interesting. Okay. Sorry, I saw a warning on one of on the stream things. So Jesus has said he's leaving. So we kind of looked at that, going to the preceding verses there. And an understandable question, Lord, where are you going? Well, my Bluetooth earpiece died, which means that y'all can still hear me and I can talk, but I can't hear you.
So anything we want to say about John?
I'll tell you what, let's do. Let me step away for just a second, and I'll give you guys a few minutes here. And when you're done, you give me the thumbs up, then I'll close out the study to go ahead and discuss. What I was going to ask about this is, Paul, when he says, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me, but you shall follow me afterwards." What do y'all think he's talking about that? And y'all go ahead and discuss this for a few minutes, and then holler at me, and I'll sign us out. Okay.
I was going to actually ask of this panel the same question. What is the answer, the real answer to Peter's question? I realize the Lord gives him an answer, but when he says, Lord, where are you going? What is the answer? If he was to get a straightforward, is he saying I'm going to heaven? As he says, I'm going to death? I'm going to a resurrection or the resurrection? What do you think here that he's saying? Brian, looks like you have some thoughts.
I think it's a great question. And of course, all could be true, right? I mean, they're all going to die. So they're all going to, we're all looking at the resurrection. But I probably think the answer is in chapter 14 and verse 2, where he goes on to say, in my Father's house, there's many mansions. I'm going to go prepare a place for you. I think that's probably the place I'm going to go. And then he'll say, and I'm going to come back and bring you there. And like I said, any of the suggestions you made are actually accurate. They're all, statements that are true. But I think probably that John 14:2-3 is the context of I'm going to my Father's house and I'm going to bring you there one day. And this is probably the question that's going on here. So
there's
that would
kind
be
of
my
an
answer.
interlude in this conversation And then Jesus gives the answer in chapter 14. You mean you are bridging an answer across a chapter division? How dare you? But I think that sounds like a good answer to me. Lord, where are you going? And he tells us in chapter 14 to not be troubled about it, but to know that I'm going to prepare a place for you. And when he says here, afterward you'll follow, that eventually you'll be there with me.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, that ties into a lot of the conversation we've dealt with in John, you know, where he talked about, I am from above and you are from beneath. And, you know, he's made observations concerning the corrupt world, religious leaders. You're not going to be able to go where I am, you know, those types of things. And I think this ties into, and remember, Jesus had just talked about this in the previous verses about being glorified, and I will no longer be with you. And so you've got Peter asking that question, I think it's like what Brian said there. You know, he's dealing with I'm going to die, but when I die, I am going to come back, and I'm going to receive you who belong to me to myself, and then you're going to join me where you are at. So that seems to be what I think he's making the point, and he's saying you can't follow me right now. You got work to do. You know, I mean, the church is just starting. I've been training you for 3 years not to go with me. You know, this isn't one of those suicide cults. You know, this is you go on, you carry on the work after I am gone, because that's what the world needs. So anyways, I guess just continuing on, you know, the verse 37, you know, why can't we follow you? You know, Peter says, why can't we follow you? I will lay down my life for you. And of course, you see the confidence of Peter in this. You see how, and incidentally, don't question the sincerity of Peter on this particular occasion. And I think it actually applies to all the apostles. You know, I mean, most of them, they had been with Jesus long enough that they knew that he was worth laying down their lives for. And remember, we just got done talking about that. You know, and Peter says, you know, I'll die for you. I'm ready. And I'm convinced that we're going to see that when we get into chapter 18, where Peter draws the sword. You know, I see Peter has this in mind. You know, I doubly see not only this, but with what Jesus says in verse 38. Will you lay down your life for me? The rooster isn't going to crow. And by the way, if you go over to the book of Mark, it says twice, the rooster will not crow twice until you have denied me 3 times. I'm kind of convinced that Peter took that personally. And what I mean by that is he said, oh, no, I won't. You know, I can see when he's drawing that sword, you know, I'm not there, but I can see the wildness of it. You know, I can see him just swinging and going back, you know, I'm going to die for you. I'm willing to die for you if that's what it takes. That's what it takes. And just going all along, I think he thought about this when he denied the first time. And as Mark said, the rooster crowed after he denied him. I think it was the first time. I think that's recorded there to remind us, more than likely, Peter in his mind thought about the words that Jesus had said to him, but then he did it again, and he did it the 3rd time. And then you go to Luke and so on. So, I mean, all of that's tied into this, you know, why can't I'll die for you. And Jesus says, Peter, you're going to deny me. And we can look at how devastating that denial was. And I do believe it was devastating. And John 21, I believe, is recording the restoration. But think about how much better of a person Peter was because of what happened on this occasion.
And
it's probably, go ahead.
Is it Luke that tells us that after he denied him the 3rd time, the rooster crowed the 2nd time, and he looked at Jesus, and Jesus was looking right at him?
Yeah, Luke, Jesus looked at him after that, and that's Luke, and that is to me one of the most chilling things tied to that, to that whole circumstance there. And he went out and wept bitterly. He knew he had failed.
I've got us right at the top of the hour, and so I'm going to hand back over to John for him to go ahead and wrap things up. John?
So we give him a thumbs up, guys.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're done. Okay. So, oh, wait a minute.
John has no
Hang on just a
sound.
second.
And we can't tell him he has
The
no
guys
sound.
at home
He
can't. The guys
hear
in my
us.
Zoom can't hear me.
Well,
there we go. Y'all
there
can
he
hear
is.
me
okay.
though. Well, appreciate that. I was able to turn on the audio for the YouTube side of it, but it's probably 30 seconds delayed. So I agreed with most everything that I heard. Actually, I agreed with everything that I heard, but I don't know if I heard everything. But all right. Well, let's plan. I really appreciate you coming and joining us for our study today. We'll plan next Thursday to continue our study through the Gospel of John. We'll pick up in the 14th chapter, the start. We're hitting a very important time period. Jesus is with his disciples, his apostles, and he's going to be giving them a very significant set of instructions, promises, and so forth, things that won't give them immediate comfort, but it will eventually bring them great comfort and will help to equip them for the work that Jesus selected them to do. Gentlemen, appreciate y'all being with us being here for the study today. If you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please send them to questions@truthfactorlive.com. Or if you'd like to email us individually, you see that on the screen there. Do John at Paul at etc. truthfactor.com. For Tom, make sure you use Tom, not Thomas. And we'll get your comments and your thoughts that you may have to share with us that way too. All righty. Well, thanks everyone. And Lord willing, we'll be back here again next Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time for another Truth Factor discussion. Y'all have a wonderful week.